I mentioned that on this last trip between surgeries, I was listening to a biography of Adoniram and Judson while driving. It's not that I didn't know these names or things like that. Obviously, I did. But the book that I read, and I have another book that I have not read yet, it's called To the Golden Shore by Courtney Anderson, The Life of Adoniram Judson. It's a much more substantial sized one. Got to get my Jim Kirk glasses out here. I'm just gonna start getting up in the morning and putting these around my neck. I have 4 or 5 pair at home, and it's just that way they're always there. Just you don't have to look for them. Yeah. Where'd they go? Yeah, that's and these work well. They really do. Anyway, I wanted to read you. I just got this, and so I knew I'd be able to find it very, very quickly, even though I didn't know the book. And I did. It took me just a matter of moments. We have, I don't know how exactly to describe it, the ease of life that we've all grown up with now. Everybody who's alive today has had a pretty easy life in comparison to people who were living on the frontier, people who were living before modern medicine, people who did not have electricity, telephones, any type of telecommunication. If your way of communicating with people far away would take weeks to months, sometimes years, okay, we've never experienced that. We have lived like kings and queens in comparison to pretty much the entire history of humanity. And we've become accustomed to it. We think it's a right. It could never go away. And we have been absolutely spoiled by it. All of us, myself included. And so when you read about what life was like in the past, I think personally, and I'm speaking to myself, you can, maybe this isn't true of you. I think that when I read about ancient people lived in ancient contexts in Rome and an Athanasius or a Gregory or someone like that, there's almost a disconnect. It was so long ago that it's hard to see where the connection is. But when you read about people in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, now we're getting up to the modern period, and you can make the connection a little bit easier. And Adoniram Judson is going into ministry at the beginning of the 19th century, so the early 1800s. And so for me anyways, maybe that's where where it clicks more, because my mom used to take me out of school and take me to Gettysburg, and so those people, Grant, Lee, they're a little bit more real to me because, I'm only a few generations removed from them. Maybe that's what makes it more along these lines. I don't know. But Adoniram, I have a feeling someday I'm going to put together a keynote presentation, because there's just so much. His conversion, the fact that a man he met in college who converted him to deism. Adoniram's traveling. He's sort of lost as to what he's going to do, where he's going to go. He's sort of been disconnected from his family. His dad's a pastor. He has told them he's a deist now. He's not finding any satisfaction, even though he's an extremely brilliant person, brilliant mind. I mean, he will eventually translate the entire Bible into Burmese. And it's the only English translation to this day. Not English translation, Bible translation into the Burmese language. He did it. He learned that language on his own. And then translated not the English into Burmese, he translated the Hebrew and Greek. So he knew Greek, he knew Hebrew, he knew Latin. Brilliant man. But he's just sort of wandering around. And he stops in this inn, this tavern/inn. And the only room they have for him is a room that's divided by a curtain. And they said, really sorry, but there's a man dying in the other half of the room. He's deathly sick. He may not get much sleep. And he stays the night, and around 4 a.m. in the morning, it gets quiet, and he gets sleep after that. He comes down, finds out that's when the guy died. And in the conversation with the innkeeper, he finds out that this fellow had gone to the same university. And when he inquires about his name, it was Eames, the guy who introduced him to deism. His friend had died moaning and groaning in a horrible fashion on the other side of that room. He has happened. Adoniram Judson was no open theist. He was no provisionist. He was no Arminian. And his very conversion involved the death of his friend, his young friend. And I just stop for a moment and ask everybody, does God have the right to do that? Where do you think that disease came from that took Eames, E-A-M-E-S, last name? Where do you think that disease came from? You see, if you don't believe in the decree of God, if you don't believe in the sovereign decree of God, which results in providence, that God's decree is involved in the actions in time, then this was pure happenstance. God was sitting in heaven going, oh, look at that. Whoa, who could have seen that? Right? That Adoniram Judson, who God has given all these gifts to, but if you're an open theist, he doesn't know he's going to go to Burma. Why did he give him all those gifts? Well, I don't know. But he just happens to stop at that inn while traveling. He's exhausted and ends up in the same room with Eames as he's dying. You don't think God had... I guarantee you one thing. Adoniram Judson knew God had everything to do with that. And he lived the rest of his life in light of the fact that God had everything to do with that. And then he gets this wild and crazy idea to become the first foreign missionary overseas to the people of Burma. And everyone looks at him like he's nuts. We are so used to overseas missions concepts that we cannot understand how rare that idea was in the early 1800s. How everybody figured you'd just throwing your life away. Let alone could you find a way of getting support for it. He has made the decision, this is what he's going to do. And he's invited over to a deacon's house at a church. And the deacon's young daughter, Anne, is sort of entertaining everyone. And he's smitten. Now, I'm not talking smitten the way that we talk about smitten in our day, where love is just all this, it's just pure emotions, and once the emotion stops, you just get a divorce and go on to somebody else. He sees in this young woman what he needs in a companion and what he's going to be doing. And so you didn't just go out on some dates and do stuff like that. Courtship was very different at that time. And once he had started communicating with her, talking with her, He writes to her parents to ask for her hand in marriage. You go there first. I did too. I talked to Kelly's dad before I asked her. Now, we were talking about marriage, but, I don't remember my parents telling me this is what you need to do. It just sort of got communicated to me somehow. But he's going overseas. He's going to Burma. And you got to realize that's not getting on a plane and flying to Burma. That's not a 2-week missions trip. Ships sank regularly. They sprung leaks. They had diseases. They became plague ships. And it took months to get across the ocean to go that far. Months. So he writes a letter to Anne's. Now, interestingly enough, her nickname that he would actually call her normally would be Nancy later on. But Anne's parents, Nancy Hasseltine, Anne Hasseltine, but normally called Nancy. He sat down and wrote to Nancy's father. And I wanted to read you what he wrote, and part of what he wrote in that letter. I have now to ask whether you can consent to part with your daughter early next spring, to see her no more in this world. Whether you can consent to her departure and her subjection to the hardships and sufferings of a missionary life. Whether you can consent to her exposure to the dangers of the ocean, to the fatal influence of the southern climate of India, to every kind of want and distress, to degradation, insult, persecution, and perhaps a violent death. Can you consent to all this for the sake of him who left his heavenly home and died for her and for you? For the sake of perishing immortal souls, for the sake of Zion and the glory of God. Can you consent to all this in hope of soon meeting your daughter in the world of glory, with the crown of righteousness, brightened with the acclamations of praise, which shall redound to her Savior, from heathens saved through her means, from eternal woe and despair? I'm just happening to look at the commentary that comes afterwards. Like I said, I haven't read this book yet. There's a different book that I read. It was a letter that must have made John Hasseltine's eyes pop nearly out of his head. One would have expected him to agree with the father of a friend of Nancy's, one of the numerous Kimball clan, who, when he heard that young Judson was paying court to Nancy Hasseltine, declared stoutly that he would tie his own daughter to the bedpost rather than let her go on such a harebrained venture. Because remember, there weren't any missionaries yet. This guy was doing something that was completely out of the norm. Now, if you're wondering, his response was, we will leave that up to her. And she, knowing what she was heading for, agreed. Married Adoniram, and shortly thereafter, they left everything. They did not get on that ship with the idea that we'll be back in a couple years. They knew that was not the case. Even though they could not have the kind of preparation that we give to missionaries today, they understood, just simply from the travel time, that it would be years before they would ever return, if they ever returned at all. And the idea was they never would. They did not expect to live. And many of the missionary couples came over there. They would lose. If the woman was pregnant, she'd lose the baby on the ship. She'd die on the ship. He'd die on the ship. Only she would arrive. I mean, there were so many of these stories that Judson himself experienced in people being sent over. The amount of death, just the number of missionaries who died. But what an amazing commitment. And he hadn't even met these people. There were no videos to watch. There were no movies. No marketing campaigns, nothing like that at all. And yet he had that commitment that he stuck to. He did come back to the United States. She had long died. And his second wife had died. All of his children to Anne had died. Some of his children to his second wife had died. Then she died. He met a woman when he was back here in the United States who was a great writer. And he got in touch with her to write the biography of his wife, Anne. They ended up marrying. But then she died. And then he became deathly ill. And while on ship, he had gone back. And the doctor said the only way that you're going to get over this is if you get out of this environment and get out to sea and stuff like that. And so they didn't have drugs. They didn't know. And like 8 or 9 days into the trip, he died at sea and was buried at sea. No grave to go to, anything like that. And yes, by the time he did come back, 30 some odd years down the road from when they left, he was now famous. Why? Because Anne had come back for a while and had written a book about their experiences. And it had been republished and republished and republished after that period of time. And so when he stepped off that ship, the one time he returned briefly to the United States, there was a huge crowd, and he was speaking all over the place, and certainly helped to expand missionary efforts as a result of all of that. But then he went back to what was now his home. The things he experienced there, the degradations, the persecutions, the imprisonment, well, that's why it's a pretty thick book. I highly recommend them to you. I bought copies of the book that I listened to for my grandkids. I bought a children's version for my youngest, who can read. And I quite literally bribed them. Read it, write a 4-page review for me, and you get real cash. Because I want them to be exposed to a mindset that is all too often not ours today. It is not that Adoniram Judson never questioned what was going on in his life. There were weeks and months of great depression after the loss of children and the loss of Anne. But he remained absolutely committed and faithful because he believed in the absolute sovereignty of God. He believed that everything that came to him came from the hand of God, and therefore it had a purpose. That changes everything. That changes everything. And I have not gone through anything in comparison to what he went through. And I'll be honest with you, it's almost makes me nervous. Because I go, I can't see how I could have endured. I can't see how I could have endured. The things that he went through, the loss of every physical possession and pretty much everyone you loved. All of these missionaries experienced death all around them. It changes how you view things. And we just don't know what that's like. But one thing that's absolutely certain, much of the theology that infects the broad spectrum of American evangelicalism could never have given birth to the modern missionary movement. Those men were Calvinists. They were Calvinists. They weren't Arminians. No open theist can begin to even have a glimpse of why Adoniram Judson or Carey or any of the others did what they did. Their theology of God is so small and so pitiful that they could never understand it. Could never understand it. Just couldn't. But can you imagine writing that letter? Being a young man? She was, I think when they, just off the top of my head, I think, because on the front here you can see they're going up the gangplank to the boat. There's Adoniram and Ann. I think, I could look it up, but I don't have time to. I think he was 23 and she was 22. 23 and 22. To have the guts to write that kind of letter? I'm sure Ann saw it. And there they go. Saying goodbye to everything that they knew. That's the kind of commitment that what's coming our way may produce again. What is that worth? What is that worth? Questions to think about.